There are a couple different ways you could look at the war right now. You could accept the White House's version. Donald Trump insists that Iran wants a deal and that the U.S. controls the Strait of Hormuz. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, says that negotiations with Iran are robust, and Trump is outright dismissing concerns about conditions on the USS Lincoln as fake news. On the other hand, you could choose not to accept the White House's version, which they are offering no facts to back up their views. Reports overnight say a ship was hit on the Strait of Hormuz, damaging the engine room and causing a crew casualty. The Wall Street Journal says American officials are worried Oman could help broker a nuclear deal that is more favorable to Tehran. That is on top of its reporting that Iran is looking to now expand the war, as Trump says Tehran should put up the white flag of surrender. And the Pentagon is now admitting that a Navy destroyer was without power for 4 days last month, leaving the crew without drinkable water, meals, running toilets, or air conditioning during that period of time. Joining me now to discuss, David Rohde, MS Now senior national security reporter, and Peter Baker still here. Okay, David, day after day, the president keeps saying things like the Strait of Hormuz, it's open, everything is great, the U.S. is in control. And now we have another ship hit overnight and a crew member dies.
It is not open. The Trump effort to reopen it has failed. And then the other strait here, this is how the war is widening, is in the Red Sea. There's fighting there. It's another Wall Street Journal story about traffic being slowed down there. 4 sailors were killed on a ship in the Red Sea last week. So the president's narrative, according to the sources I'm talking to, and just basic fact, is false.
Peter, right now Oman is negotiating with Iran over the strait. And in the midst of that, we talked about it yesterday, the president threatened to bomb the you-know-what out of Oman, a U.S. military ally, for almost 50 years. I don't know how else to look at this, but that the United States is trapped in this war, and everything the president is saying and doing just isn't rooted in fact.
Yeah, it's so striking. You're right to point that out. We've gotten so inured to a president who is willing to say and sometimes do almost anything that somehow we've lost the capacity for shock. But in fact, to sit there and just sort of randomly, almost cavalierly threaten war against a country with which we have friendly relations is, in fact, a striking moment. And it tells us something that he wants to be belligerent with the countries that have been friendly to us. At the same time, he's once again talking about how he has such great respect for Kim Jong-un and North Korea, and he wants to stop military exercises because it's so mean to North Korea, which, by the way, has something like 60 nuclear warheads compared to 0 right now in Iran. And he says the whole point of the Iran war was to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. Well, on his watch and on President Biden's watch, North Korea has expanded its nuclear arsenal substantially without any kind of action or, consequence from the United States. You have a president who seems to think that Kim Jong-un is his friend and Oman is not.
Okay, we've been talking about this for days. We've been covering this story on this network for weeks. We now have the families of sailors on board the Lincoln furious that the president is dismissing their concerns about the conditions on the ship, saying it's fake news. And now we learned that a destroyer was without power for 4 days. What is the American public supposed to make of this?
That the U.S. Navy is under tremendous strain, that previous administrations maybe didn't build enough ships to be fair. But this is just an unforced political error by President Trump. There's no need to belittle these
going
sailors.
To war?
Well, there's the strategic error, but the political...
Also an unforced political
correct.
error.
And just on Oman, they're angry at the Omani foreign minister. I interviewed him right before the war started. He said the Iranians are willing to negotiate. And the administration rejected that advice. This was February 27th. I interviewed the Omani foreign minister. He was leading the talks. February 28th, President Trump chose to bomb. So that's why they're mad at Oman. But it's a basic political error to belittle the families of sailors and belittle sailors who are out on these boats for 12 months at a time. And we are unable to resupply them. Why? Because Pete Hegseth hid the fact that Iran destroyed the main resupply base that the United States has in the Gulf. He did not make that public in press conference after press conference, and that is, again, the way that they have mishandled this war. But just why would the president belittle our service members and their families? It just makes no sense to me politically.
It's astounding. All right, Peter, new but related topic. Jared Kushner, who we just need to remind our audience, again, is not a government employee, just met with both Hamas and Netanyahu about the Gaza peace deal. Is there any indication that there was any progress? And of course, we need to remind our audience, Jared Kushner has had a very close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu his entire life. As a child, when Netanyahu would visit New York, he would stay in the Kushner home in New Jersey in Jared's childhood bedroom.
Yeah, whether he resents losing his bedroom for that or not, we don't remember. But Jared Kushner is an odd figure here because you're right. He's not a government official. He's somebody who's in the private sector, who's doing business in the Middle East, has billions of dollars of investment from the Saudis, is running around the region, making deals. At the same time, he's serving as an effective envoy for the president of the United States to Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas, interestingly enough. Now, remember, it wasn't that long ago, you and I, Steph, are old enough to remember when the president announced that he's got a deal between Hamas and ending this Gaza conflict. That was so far ago that we can't even remember what that deal was like because the Israelis rejected it. Hamas didn't agree with our definitions, and that seems to now be off the table. So we're trying to get something back on the table. Now, it is interesting and important that the administration, in the person of Jared Kushner, is not giving up. It's still trying. It would, the question of whether they're committed to trying to find some sort of a peaceful resolution in the Middle East is important. And they should be, we should take note of that. But what Jared's doing and what he's offering, the different size and what, authority he has from the president of the United States, his father-in-law, we don't really know.
Yeah, my question is he committed because he actually wants to help create peace in the Middle East? Or is it so he can get the bulldozers in there to create the Riviera a la Gaza?
MS Now's Pentagon reporter Priya Sridhar is back with us. I also want to bring in John Brennan, former CIA director and MS Now senior national security and intelligence analyst, along with former New York Congressman Max Rose, senior advisor for Vote Vets. Priya, you were on this story before almost anyone else. The USS Lincoln has shared videos from sailors on board celebrating their strength and their resilience. What do you know about those new posts and what is really happening on board that ship?
Yeah, Alicia, it seems like the military is on somewhat of a PR campaign right now, and it really aligns with the messaging that we've seen from many of the political appointees who are in charge of the military, like the chief spokesperson for the Pentagon and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Acting Secretary of the Navy Hung Cao, who have tried to blame all of this on the shameful media who are apparently trying to characterize these service members and their families as victims. And Sean Parnell even tried to point to his own deployment. And we've seen a lot of that sort of rhetoric about how, the military is obviously a place where you're not going to see luxurious conditions. These are what deployments are like. But I can tell you, Alicia, that this deployment was not standard at all. 208 continuous days at sea with no port calls is not normal. Aircraft carriers typically stop every 30 to 45 days. And in addition to that, you're seeing what's usually a 6 to 7 month deployment for these aircraft carriers being extended indefinitely 9 to 12 months long. So that is really what caused all of these issues when it comes to exhaustion and morale with the service members on the ship. Their supply shortages were real. The Navy leaders have acknowledged it themselves. They say this was a result of Iranian missiles striking the Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, and they had to pivot to another military base on an island that was 2,200 miles away from the Gulf of Oman, where this aircraft carrier sits. So none of this was made up. This was all very real. And we're seeing these leaders scramble to try to cover it up, essentially.
Let's talk about that scramble. Director Brennan, the top military official overseeing the war, Admiral Brad Cooper, visited the aircraft carrier over the weekend. He wrote an op-ed released Sunday in the Wall Street Journal saying that many of the issues are, quote, old news, and crew members were, quote, tired, but they continue to fire on all cylinders. Families of those sailors dispute that, with one woman saying enlisting in the Navy was a dream for her son, but that dream has now been shattered. Quote, he just can't wait to be done, she says, adding Donald Trump needs to be ashamed of himself. Director Brennan, what do you make of the conflict between what you have military commanders saying and what we are hearing from the sailors and their family members?
Well, I think Admiral Cooper owes it to the servicemen and women who are aboard the carriers and the other ships to try to remedy the situation out there. and not just with nice words. Yes, war can be tough. It can be grueling. At the same time, there's an obligation on the part of those in charge to make sure that the best available conditions and supplies are available. And as has been mentioned, I mean, it shows the real lack of planning that went into this conflict. The fact that the major supply depot in the Middle East, the U.S. Sixth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, was virtually destroyed at the beginning of this conflict, and they haven't been able to really replace it or refurbish it. It just demonstrates that they were not expecting the type of response from Iran. And so again, also it just underscores just how awful and, unfortunate this conflict has been. But again, I think Admiral Cooper and others really owe it to the men and women aboard these vessels to do everything possible to make the conditions better, and not just with a lot of nice words publicly.
Yeah, I mean, Max, I keep thinking about something that Amy McGrath said to me last week, which is like, members of the armed services don't need to be coddled, but they do need strong leadership. And she is one of the folks who's calling out Secretary Hegseth and his leadership in all of this. Senator Kelly, who was himself a retired naval officer, had a response to what we've heard from the president about the possibility that this deployment was, quote, not long enough. Take a listen.
The president's comments are just uncalled for. I mean, he's a guy that has spent a good portion of his adult life sitting on gold toilets and doesn't know what hardship is and doesn't understand our service members. In fact, it's insulting what he said, that the deployment wasn't long enough. He doesn't know sacrifice.
Do you agree?
Of course. I mean, but this should come as no surprise that Donald Trump and his administration are doing this. Of course, Trump referred to the fallen as suckers and losers. We have known how he looks at service members behind closed doors for many years. But this speaks to something larger as well about the administration's strategy and priorities. They got money. They have money for the ballrooms. They have money for him to have massive security as he decides to golf all around the country at his various properties. But what they didn't do is plan for a protracted conflict. That's why this is happening on the Lincoln. They said this was going to be a 4 to 6 week conflict. In fact, they said it was going to be so short, they didn't have to go to Congress for it. They didn't have to plan. They put a bunch of generals in who are sycophants because they fired all those who want to talk independently. They decided to engage in culture war as a department, focusing on issues of diversity, focusing on issues of learning history, all the while forgetting about actually planning for a protracted conflict before they get into it. So no wonder what we're seeing on the Lincoln is actually occurring. But it's part of a much larger story about how they did not plan for this conflict and how it is reckless and unconstitutional.
Priya, can you just pick up on the point that the congressman is making here about misplaced priorities? What do we know about the president's desire to change U.S. aircraft carriers, not in function, but in form?
Yeah, this was a fascinating exclusive from the Washington Post that essentially saying that President Trump wants to move the multi-story command and control tower that's typically in the back of an aircraft carrier back to the middle of the aircraft carrier like we saw in World War II. And what most experts would tell you is that it's actually safer and more efficient for that multi-story command and control tower to be at the back of the ship because it allows the aircraft to be closer to the catapult where they launch and take off from, and also to land. In addition to that, he's saying that he wants to replace the electromagnetic catapult that launches the aircraft into the air with a steam-powered catapult like they were using back in World War II. Not only are these changes going to cost billions of dollars, they're also going to delay when these 4 Ford-class aircraft carriers are going to be deployable. And I think at a time when you're seeing the 11 aircraft carriers that we already have in the U.S. Navy fleet be stretched and stretched thin, I think a lot of people in the Navy are wondering, why are we prioritizing aesthetic over safety and efficiency right now?
Yeah, I mean, Director Brennan, I don't know how you go into that meeting with the president or his emissaries and not walk out simply saying, like, you got to be kidding me. This is the priority.
That's exactly right. I think it's criminal, the fact that members of the cabinet actually listened to Donald Trump musing about, the redesign of aircraft carriers. He has no experience whatsoever, no expertise. All of the things that he is doing and saying just demonstrates the extent of his incompetence and recklessness. as the former congressman said. And so therefore, again, what he is doing to our men and women, I think it should worry every single member of the U.S. military and their families in terms of the callousness and the recklessness with which he pursues his commander-in-chief role. And so, again, I think we still have a long way to go in this administration with more problems ahead.
Priya, the USS George Washington is going to relieve the USS Lincoln. Talk to us about the decision to send the Washington. Why is that its own controversy?
Yeah, that's right, Alicia. So a lot of the family members of the sailors on the Lincoln confronted Navy leadership at that town hall in person in San Diego on August 6th. And they asked, listen, why can't we send the George Washington to the Middle East? It will obviously get there faster because its home port is actually in Japan. And the acting secretary of the Navy at the time said, no, of course, we cannot send that aircraft carrier because we need to leave it in Japan. The United States has always had an aircraft carrier in Japan since 1973. And the reason for that is because of all the different adversaries that the United States has in that 7th Fleet area of operations. We're talking China, we're talking North Korea, and also Russia. And so if you move that aircraft carrier to the Middle East, it would take the United States 17 days to get an aircraft carrier from mainland United States over to that part of the world. So that means some place like China would have a 17-day head start. And that's why Navy leaders were focused on sending the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is home ported in San Diego, to relieve the Lincoln. But I think, again, they're scrambling right now to solve this huge publicity nightmare, which is the conditions and the morale and the exhaustion and the dangerousness that we're seeing with the Lincoln.
Max, you have Democrats on the Senate Armed Services Committee. They sent a letter to Defense Secretary Hegseth demanding answers about the troubling reports of poor conditions on the Lincoln. I'm curious sort of what oversight you think is actually effective there, especially since, if I'm understanding you correctly, part of what you're saying is the ship is emblematic of a bigger problem and challenge here, which is he has entered a conflict that he did not have clear stated goals on. He was not able to communicate them to the American people, much less to these service members. He now doesn't have a plan for exit. And so in some ways, contending with the question of the ship is almost the best, an immediate way to articulate to people sort of the fecklessness of the administration in a larger sense.
Absolutely. It's part of a larger narrative. And that is exactly the story that Senate Democrats and House Democrats, for that matter, should be telling. They can tell that story through letters. They can tell that story, obviously, through their own remarks. But the questions that they ask are the most important tool that they have in oversight of these, whether it is the generals, senior military leaders, or the senior leaders of the administration that will go before them. And the more specific the questions they ask, the better. How did it get to the point where the Lincoln did not have enough food? How did it get to the point? Did you plan for that? But also, did you plan for the military bases throughout the region to get bombed? Did you prepare in advance for them to have the proper defenses? The specificity of their questions will be their greatest strength.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. As the second summer of Donald Trump's second presidency sinks into territory that can only be described as a hot mess, with skyrocketing gas and grocery prices, multiple public health crises growing at the same time, and Trump's war with Iran showing no sign of ending, Trump and his cabinet seem to be focused on something else, really everything and anything other than the business of making people's lives better by governing. As practically Donald Trump's entire cabinet hits the campaign trail, as Trump's poll numbers plummet with less than 80 days to go until the midterms. Yesterday, as the memorandum of understanding with Iran expired, Pete Hegseth was off stumping. The Wall Street Journal reports this, quote, according to the lawyers, I'm only here in a personal capacity today, Hegseth said, roughly halfway through what was essentially a 19-minute campaign speech for Republican congressional candidate Zach Nunn. President Trump, military spending, the Iran war, and perhaps himself down the road. And while Pete Hegseth was out stumping for Republican candidates and additional funding for what appears to many Americans to be a new forever war with Iran, more alarming details are coming to light about the conditions our service members have been forced to endure. Washington Post is reporting that, quote, a U.S. Navy destroyer experienced a complete loss of power while deployed in the South China Sea last month, leaving sailors without drinkable water meals, running toilets or air conditioning for 4 days. It comes on the heels of those reports of soldiers on the USS Lincoln attempting to jump overboard due to conditions on that ship. Pete Hegseth is not the only cabinet secretary hitting the campaign trail, as crises he is directly responsible for spiral out of control. RFK Jr., of all people, also hit the trail as measles cases hit a 35-year high among declining vaccination rates. The nation's cyclospora outbreak continues to rage on as well. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, hit the campaign trail amid growing signs that Trump's economy isn't getting better anytime soon, with just a few of the top stories on the New York Times website right now, focusing on rising oil prices and global economic instability. Also on the campaign trail for Republicans, the SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler, the Veterans Affairs Secretary Doug Collins, and the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. And if you're looking for a logical explanation for what seems like the entire executive branch and White House staff hitting the campaign trail, maybe they're trying to distract from Trump's own poll numbers. Trump hit yet another polling low, with just 33% saying they support him and a whopping 64% disapproving of the job Donald Trump is doing as president in a new Reuters poll. Donald Trump and his administration trying to sell a deeply unpopular agenda to a dwindling base of MAGA enthusiasts as Trump's poll numbers plunge to brand new lows, is where we begin today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Paul Rieckhoff is here. He's the host of the Independent Americans podcast. He's also the founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America. Also joining us, political analyst, the former Senator Claire McCaskill is here for the hour, and former RNC chairman, co-host of the weeknight, my dear friend Michael Steele, is here as well. I'll start with you, Claire. You were a senator on the Armed Services Committee. You, I think, recount stories of bipartisan concern for the men and women of the military, particularly active duty and their families. This is nothing less than a FU from Donald Trump, who said things like, quote, their deployment should have been longer, about the aircraft carrier with those terrible conditions that our colleague Priya Sridhar has been reporting on over the last several weeks.
Yeah, I just want people to realize how dramatically the Senate has changed when it comes to the oversight of our military. It really was an oasis of bipartisanship. It was not unusual when we would do the annual defense bill markup that we would have votes that were like 13-10, and half the Democrats would be on one side and half the Democrats would be on another side, and vice versa with the Republicans. There was very rarely was there anything that was party line. And I think the committee embraced that because they wanted our military to embrace that. Because in America, our military is not one party or the other, just like our police force is not supposed to be one party or the other, or the Department of Justice is supposed to be one party or the other. So this idea that they're, first of all, disrespecting the troops and saying hollowly, oh, they come first when they're not taking care of them. But really the nerve of the Secretary of Defense being out campaigning for people. I can't even imagine under any scenario that any defense chief would have ever done that in the past. It is truly outrageous. And that really is disrespecting the troops because it's sending a message to them. Our politics is more important than your well-being.
I mean, the thing about it, Paul Rieckhoff, is that is essentially the message that comes from the podium. This is what Pete Hegseth said about campaigning for the midterms. Quote, when Republican Congressman Zach Nunn asked if I'd come on out here, it was an absolute no-brainer, Hegseth said. So it's not only not what Claire experienced or recalls, it's not even what they're pretending to be about, atop a Pentagon, atop a military at war.
I think it's a wake-up call moment for America, and we've had so many of them, but to use a Hegseth line, it's an F around and find out. This is what happens when you make Pete Hegseth your defense secretary. This is what happens when you make Kennedy in charge of our health care. This is what happens when you have Donald Trump, who has refused to abide by the norms that separate our politics from our military. All the norms are gone now. The guardrails are completely gone now. And you've got Hegseth, who is openly campaigning in a way that would never even remotely be accepted, even by Republicans like Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld. They never did anything remotely like this because they understood how sacred that distinction was between our politics and our military. They blurred it all together. This is one of my biggest concerns about having Trump in office, is that he doesn't care about mixing our politics with our troops. And he's also got this other problem, which is the USS Lincoln. Every president kind of has a moment like this where things can go sideways. Bush had the Walter Reed scandal. Obama had Shinseki and the backlog. And then it comes down to how do you handle it? And the reality is we can't trust them to be honest about anything. And that includes the welfare of our troops in harm's way. And at the same time, the troops are speaking out as best they can. Their families are speaking out. And I think Trump is really losing that narrative around the Lincoln because people of all backgrounds don't tolerate it when our troops are getting screwed and when our troops are not taken care of. That cuts through all partisan lines. And I think it's going to run across all these other administrators who are out trying to campaign. The Lincoln's just going to keep coming back, and it's going to drag them down, especially with Republicans.
I mean, Paul, to be honest and to be fair, Bush had body armor before he had, I think that was one of the first crises, and military families were raising money and sending their own body armor over to Afghanistan and Iraq. There was also inadequate arming of the Humvees at a time when I think it was Iran was planting roadside bombs. I've lived this, and I try to be transparent about what I learned from mistakes that I was a part of. But I have never been a part of smearing the families who are speaking on behalf of the men and women of the military that cannot. Can you just give voice to how far things have to go for the men and women of the military to be at a place where their family members feel comfortable speaking out under these leaders?
I'm glad you referenced the body armor issues and that time, because that was when I first spoke out. I came home and talked about body armor, and I was opposite President Bush, one of the first to speak out and challenge him on that. And I got called a traitor, and Sean Hannity came after me, and everyone else said, oh, this isn't a real issue. We also were talking about the emergence of an insurgency, which was also downplayed by the Bush administration. But I think what you're hearing is the ground truth, and the troops can always be counted on to give the ground truth, what's really happening on a ship or on the ground. And this is a time where this administration has tried to spin it away, maybe most effectively by removing all embeds. We're not hearing how our troops are doing because there are no embedded reporters with them, which was standard for really generations and such an important circuit breaker for our military families, most of all, to know how their men and women were doing. So now in the age of social media, they're going around the administration, they're going around the media, and they're calling out directly to the American people saying, we're not getting taken care of. And now you can argue about how much food they should get or how tough it might be, but the reality is this ship has been out there for a long time, way beyond expectation, and the communication hasn't been good with the families or with the troops. I got extended a number of times during Iraq. That became standard during Iraq. But where you really screw up is when you mismanage expectations, when you're not clear with the families, where you don't feel like the families are being taken care of, and that's who you're hearing from the most. And that is just so devastating politically for whoever's in charge. When you have moms and husbands and wives and kids speaking out about their troops in harm's way not getting taken care of, that kills you at the polls, and it kills you even with your base.
There's probably never an easy time to be a defense secretary, but right now there's really a lot on Pete Hegseth's plate. He's been trying to downplay reports of a mental health crisis and dwindling rations on the USS Abraham Lincoln, aircraft carrier supporting operations for Trump's war of choice in Iran. He's also confronting a president scrambling our traditional alliances, punishing South Korea because they didn't want to get involved in the war in Iran, scaling back joining military drills, and once again praising Kim Jong-un. With all this going on, and it is a lot, you might think Hegseth doesn't have time for anything but focusing on national security. But you would be wrong, because Hegseth was in Iowa yesterday, fundraising for a Republican congressman. I want to bring Atlantic staff writer Tom Nichols and MS Now Pentagon reporter Priya Sridhar. Tom, Hegseth, he has time to hit the campaign trail with everything else going on?
He has record now in his job of doing everything except his job. He seems to think his job is being a sycophant to the president, working out with the troops, getting some jungle training in, doing all kinds of things that would be perfectly reasonable if he were still a captain in the Army, but are not the job of a Secretary of Defense. And meanwhile, all of the other problems that you mentioned start to pile up, including losing war. In any other administration, Hegseth would be gone over these issues. But this is not any other administration. He knows that keeping an audience of one happy is his job, and then taking time out in his, I hate to ever use air quotes, but his personal capacity to go to Iowa to campaign for people. You have to wonder what people in Iowa are thinking about why the Secretary of Defense is out there while people are, on board ships for long deployments, and we're in the middle of a war with a country of 93 million people.
Yeah, let's talk about the air quotes that Tom just used there, Priya. I know we talk a lot about norms. Is there any world where another defense secretary, where a James Mattis or a Mark Esper would be stumping for the midterms?
Yeah, Alicia, this is a huge departure from the way we would traditionally see Secretary of Defenses in public. Of course, they are political appointees, but the military as an institution is supposed to be apolitical. Obviously, uniformed members of the military are forbidden from going to campaign events or making sort of political opinions. But this isn't even the first time we've seen Secretary of Defense Hegseth do this. Back in May, he went to Kentucky and sort of slammed Representative Thomas Massie, who, of course, had a falling out with President Trump, and he endorsed his opponent, who ended up winning that primary. So we've seen Secretary Hegseth insert politics into everything in the military, including trying to sort of wage these culture wars that President Trump has also tried to do, speaking about woke culture in the military, trying to get rid of DEI policies, and also firing any senior military officers or blocking their promotions who he believes sort of tried to promote ideologies that were consistent with previous administrations. So while this is not normal for any previous secretaries of defense, it's definitely on brand for Secretary Hegseth.
What a brand that is. Tom, you've been writing Trump is making South Korea pay for his Iran humiliation. I want to play some of what the president said about his decision to scale back joint military drills with South Korea. Take a listen.
I said, would you like to give us a little hand? We don't need help with Iran, but if you'd like, give us a hand with Iran. He said, no, thanks. And I said, wait a minute, we have 39,000 soldiers over there guarding you from Kim Jong-un, your next door neighbor, and you're not going to help us on a very easy military operation in Iran? That's strange. No, we'd rather not get involved. I say, well, why are we involved in helping you?
So yesterday, Tom, I was on with Priya, who in her former role as a U.S. Navy officer had actually done some of these drills. And Priya reminded me that it is about the fact that when all of a sudden, God forbid, you end up in a scenario where you actually have to execute on some of these plans, you don't want it to be the first time when the stakes are high and the consequences matter. You want to have this experience of having done the drill, of having figured out how to work together. And what is so wrong about what the president said in that clip is he acts as though we are doing South Korea a favor, as though there is no strategic rationale for the United States to be conducting those drills and positioned there. Talk to me about what he is getting wrong about the U.S.'s national security.
Okay, first, everything.
Sorry.
I mean, that sums it up right there. But, the other problem here is, first of all, that whole conversation that he just relayed, you can choose to believe that that's how it happened. Can't imagine the South Koreans saying that. But also, if Iran is such an easy lift, why do we need the South Koreans? Leaving that aside, we're ignoring, or Donald Trump especially is ignoring, thousands of North Korean troops who are fighting alongside Russians in Europe against a friend of the United States, gaining battle experience by fighting in Europe with Russia. And what Trump ought to be saying to the South Koreans is, how can we make North Korea pay for this insane adventurism with North Korean troops running around in Europe? And instead, he's treating the South Koreans as if they are, somebody that's really let him down. And I think that that's part of his rage about Iran. He can't make Iran pay. He's afraid of Russia. He's afraid of China. He's afraid of offending the North Koreans. And so he's going to lash out at people who he thinks just have to stand there and take it. The fact of the matter is, and Priya, having been involved in these, knows this, one of the great dangers in Korea is that the North Koreans basically hold the South Korean capital hostage because it is so close to their border. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world. And we're there to defend a friend, to stand up for what's right, and also to defend a system of trade and security that spans the globe and protects the safety and the standard of living of Americans, even if they don't realize that. If Americans want to live in a world where the Chinese and the Russians make the rules of the international system, we can do that. But people aren't going to like it. And by the time they figure out it's happening, it'll be too late.
Tom, I asked you what the president was getting wrong about national security. You said everything. Thank you for elucidating exactly what you meant by everything. Tom Nichols, Priya Sridhar, thank you both so much for being with us.
You get it. We want to bring in the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, the Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. Senator Reed, I appreciate your being with us here on State of Play. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
You, along with your fellow Democratic members on this Armed Services Committee, are now demanding answers from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth about these poor conditions on board the USS Abraham Lincoln. What do you need to hear from Hegseth, and how do you intend to hold this administration accountable?
Well, we intend to hear what exactly happened. What were the structural defects in the ship, broken plumbing, etc.? What were these crew members going through for 250 days? That is an excessive time at sea, particularly in a combat zone. And we want answers. And we also want him to tell us what's ahead. What about our other ships? The George Washington is coming in to relieve the Abraham Lincoln. Is that ship ready to extend further? But most importantly, and this has not taken place, what is their plan? What do they intend to do? How long will it take? What resources do they need? What are the options they're considering? They've basically sort of shut us all out. And that's not just Democrats. That's my Republican colleagues also.
And Senator, let me ask you, you make note of the USS George Washington that is now headed to the Middle East that would replace the USS Abraham Lincoln there. It's significant not just because of the change that we'll see, taking place in that region, but what it means and the vacuum it leaves behind in the Pacific. It'll be the first time that we are without a U.S. carrier presence in that region. Why is that such a significant concern, and what message does that send to China?
Well, it sends a message to China is we're not as prepared as we were to deter any actions you might take that are contrary to the United States. We're sending them a signal that we're missing in action, literally. This is a strategic blunder of the first order, consistent with so many things that Trump has done. His focus on the Americas rather than his focus on the greatest threats we face, which is China and Russia. All of this is strategic miscalculation, very poor plans. They're simply trying to make it up as they go, literally day by day. And that's going to give the Chinese, I think, unfortunately, the notion that they may be prepared or better able to take us on. And that's the wrong message to send to China or to North Korea.
Excuse my interruption. Senator Reed, help me understand this for a second. I think a lot of people watching this conversation are asking the same thing right now. Iran, we know, wants nuclear weapons. North Korea already has nuclear weapons. The president here is effectively siding with Kim Jong-un, who in an extended post that he wrote earlier today described the North Korean leader as unthreatening and respectful. How How do you respond to that language about an authoritarian dictator?
Well, the president, in this sense, is delusional. He has this egomania that says every powerful figure in the world must bow down to me. They do that. That's exactly the approach he took to Putin when he took over. The Ukrainians, he dismissed. He said, you don't have the cards, etc. There was this relationship with Putin, and we know how that is going wrong. And it's the same situation with North Korea. Kim Jong-un is not, I think, terribly impressed with Donald Trump. And withdrawing forces from Korea, canceling exercises, plays into his game. So this is just, again, a terrible strategy and a reflection of just the egomania and the self-centeredness of the president. There's no strategy.
I want to ask you, if I can, President Trump told Fox News just this morning that he is, in his words, in no hurry to reach a deal with Iran. He also threatened to bomb the expletive out of Oman if they get in the way of a deal with Iran to manage the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of this threat to Oman, another U.S. ally? Why this hostility to our friends in that region?
Well, he does not have, I think, a grasp of the situation in detail of what the real options are. He's floundering around trying to come up with something. And he takes out his animosity, which is constant, on the closest target. He's upset that the Omani have talked to the Iranians, etc. But it's all spite. It's all a childish spite. It's not strategy. It's not doing the best for the country. And they're threats that are, in many cases, idle. He's been threatening to destroy Iran, and then 2 days later, he says peace is just a few days away.
Right.
This is sending a signal to the Iranians that he's not capable and also not tuned into the real world.
Senator, my time's limited. One quick last question I wanted to ask you. Yes. President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is said to be meeting today with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after meeting with Hamas leadership yesterday. Obviously, he's not a government official. That means that Congress has really no oversight over any actions that he's taking. Why is that dangerous? Is that dangerous?
Well, it is dangerous because he's sort of playing not only his part for the president, but also his part for himself. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, business activities going on in the same spirit that he's talking to other people. So, this is a situation where he does not have the background. He doesn't have the vetting that's necessary to be an official representative of the United States. And his business enterprises, I don't think, are too far away from any of his sort of strategic discussions. That's wrong.
Senator Jack Reed, Rhode Island Democrat, we very much appreciate you making time to speak to us here on State of Play.
Thank you.